In this, the second module of the Darwin Deleted lecture, we're going to take a bit of a biographical peek at Charles Darwin. Let's start with his boyhood to see what kind of a boy he was, what kind of a background he came from. Charles Darwin was the grandson of a very famous medical practitioner in his day. He was also a radical and came up with his own theory of evolution that looked quite like Lamarck's theory of evolution and not really like anything Darwin was to come up with in the 1830s. His father, Robert Darwin, was a huge man. You can imagine the struggle that his horse and carriage had, taking him about the neighbourhood of Shrewsbury, where the Darwins lived. Robert Darwin was a medical practitioner. Not only a medical practitioner, but a highly successful medical practitioner. Not only a highly successful medical practitioner, a highly successful capitalist as well. The Darwins were a wealthy family, but Robert Darwin would not let that rest. He used the family's money to boost the family's money, and the way that he did that was by becoming a venture capitalist. He would lend money to various projects in the area where the Darwins lived, around Shrewsbury in Shropshire. People that wanted to build canals or roads or other forms of infrastructure or buildings, or even buy farms. He would lend people money and get a very healthy return on it. And as a consequence, made the Darwins an extremely well-off and extremely comfortable family. Robert Darwin has been portrayed in a number of different ways. Often people have said that he was a tyrant, a very strict, a very stern father, very demanding. But the evidence is that he was far more of a kindly man, and certainly Charles felt very well disposed towards his father, Robert Darwin. In fact, he used to go out with him on Robert Darwin's medical rounds. Darwin's mother was a Wedgwood. The Wedgwoods, as some of you will know, were the famous pottery family who were responsible for starting up one of the first industrial scale mass producers of very fine chinaware and also medallions and other forms of adornment. The Wedgwoods had become extremely wealthy on the back of this. They were some of the first and most successful of the new industrialists in the new industrial era. Darwin's mother died when Darwin was very young. He was only about 6 or 7 years old when she succumbed to an excruciatingly painful stomach complaint. It might have been peritonitis. Died an agonising death. Darwin claimed to know nothing about this whatsoever. And there's been an assumption that he's blacked it out as some kind of a trauma and that it might have left an emotional void. Now, personally, I'm not really into what could be called psychobiographical musings. I'm just putting this out there for the way that some of Darwin's biographers have portrayed Darwin and how his psyche was formed by his early life. One of the amazing things you might think about Darwin, considering what he went on to achieve, was that there were actually no visible signs of genius whatsoever. As a young boy, he liked doing young boys' things, collecting stuff, collecting materials that he'd find around, starting to build collections of pottery, of birds' eggs, of all sorts of different things. But beyond that, there wasn't any sign of the kind of individual that he was going to become. He was sent to school at the local private school, or public school as we call them in England, rather confusingly, Shrewsbury, an ancient school. And he was sent there to board, even though it was less than a couple of kilometres from the house that he stayed in Shrewsbury, the man. At school, he signally failed to excel. Nobody really noticed him. Nobody certainly noticed his genius. One thing that we do know about this time, apart from the fact that he seems to have been really uninspired by the dry classical education that he would have got at this type of institution, we know that him and his older brother Erasmus had set up a chemistry laboratory in the shed in their house, the Mount. And him and Erasmus used to sneak away from school to go and conduct chemistry experiments back at home. The thing that we have to understand about Darwin is that he comes from what we would call a very posh background. His social background is gentry. That's like one rung below the aristocracy. And because of this, he behaves in the way that the gentry behave. He likes doing the things that the gentry like doing. One of those things is hunting. And Darwin was very fond of these kind of country pursuits, the hunting and fishing and all of that. It was a thing that took up a lot of his time. He loved dogs as well. These were the things that really stood out about him as a young man. But on top of that, because of the activities of his father, Robert, he was always going to have financial independence. There was never any question that he was going to need to work for a living. This was the life of a gentleman. Having said that, they did like to train their sons up to a profession. And Robert was very concerned that both his eldest children, Erasmus and Charles, get a profession. And the profession that he wanted them to get was the profession of medicine. He wanted them to follow in his footsteps. A couple of years before 1825, Erasmus had gone up to Edinburgh to study medicine, Edinburgh being one of the main medical schools, not just in Britain, but also in Europe. And it was decided that at the age of 16, Charles should join Erasmus in Edinburgh. Now, there are a number of things that we can note about his sojourn in Edinburgh. He became very influenced by Robert Edmund Grant, who seems to have been, for a short period, an early mentor and influence. Now, the thing about Grant is that he was an early evolutionist, or a transmutationist, as we call them. He was a follower of Lamarck's doctrines, and people have often wondered if that had any influence upon Darwin's view of evolution. It became very clear that Darwin was interested in science. He loved nature, he loved natural history, he loved going to the chemistry lectures of Thomas Hope, and he began to get interested in geology as well. He also learnt taxidermy from a freed slave named James Edmonston. This was going to be a useful skill for anyone that liked hunting. He liked to stuff the birds he had shot, but also a very useful skill for a budding naturalist. But the one thing that he didn't take to was medicine. In fact, very early on, he decided that he had a rampant dislike for its practice. Now, the reason for this was not because of the study, although that was arduous, or the lectures, although some of them were incredibly boring. It was the empathetic nature of Darwin himself. As a medical student, one of the things you had to do was go and witness operations. And the first operation that Darwin went to see was an amputation performed on a child. And it made him sick. It made him physically sick. And it turned him off medicine for life. So obviously, medicine was not going to be young Bobby's or Charles Roberts' profession. And his father says, okay, if you're not going to become a doctor, and there's no reason, you don't seem to be the kind of fella that wants to go into the military, then there's only one other place for you to go. And that is the Church of England. To become a country parson, a vicar, a priest in the establishment church. And if you wanted to become a priest in the established church, you had to go and study at one of two places, at either Oxford or Cambridge. And it was decided that Charles should go to Cambridge. And he entered Christ's College in 1827 to study for a BA, which was the prerequisite to become a country parson or whatever. So the full intention is that he's going to Cambridge, get his BA, and then enter the Church of England, take holy orders. But it was not to be, although during the whole course of his studies at Cambridge, that remained his intention and his family's intention. But what Cambridge did was it gave him an enormous amount of possibility of engaging again with the natural world, engaging with science. For example, when he got to Cambridge, there was a beetle craze going on, not the sort of crazy beetle mania kind of thing that happened in the 1960s, but a craze for collecting beetles, for people going out and trying to find the rarest specimens, or even identifying a new species. And he got completely and utterly immersed in the beetle craze, even hiring a servant to go out and collect beetles for him. But perhaps the most important thing to understand about the milieu that he had entered was his immersion in the Paleite universe of natural theology. Now, I'm sure some of you will know what I'm talking about here, and other people will not. The thing that we have to remember about the Church of England at this time, and about Cambridge and Oxford, where people were trained to become priests in the Church of England, was that to teach in these places, you had to be ordained yourself. Everyone was a reverend. So you might get the professor of geology teaching geology, but the fact was he was ordained. He was the Reverend Sedgwick, as we will see slightly later on. Now, these were all men of the cloth, and they were all believers in divine creation, but it was not the divine creation of 6 days followed by the day of rest portrayed in Genesis. It was a far more subtle, longer, deeper process of creation. But most important of all, they all believed to a man that if you studied nature, you were studying God's design. And this was the point of view put forward by Paley in his natural theology, or evidences of the existence and attributes of the deity, which we will be looking at in more detail later on. Paley, of course, was the man who used the watchmaker analogy, the idea that if you were walking along a heath and tripped over a stone, you might say, oh, that's just a stone. But if you found a watch and picked it up and looked at it, you could discern that it had been designed. And he said, if you look at the stone, or if you look at plants in more details, you can discern their complexity, their perfection, the fact that they too have been designed. And we can infer from nature that there was a designer. And the Paleite universe was what dominated British science at this period. We can see him getting some form of training to become a scientist, and someone like Adam Sedgwick was deeply responsible for that, taking Darwin on walking tours. Ironically, Sedgwick was going to become a massive critic of Darwin's when Origin of Species came out. The gentlemanly and extremely kind Henslow might have been his early model of a gentlemanly scientist, and certainly someone who was deeply influential in shaping Darwin's early worldview. We can see through all of this that being at Cambridge, he was able to make connections and get patrons. And one of the things that this did was allow him to get the connections which were going to get him the gig of travelling on the Beagle and sailing around the world and seeing the enormity of creation and the complexity of creation, and to begin to collect the materials and ideas that would emerge in his evolutionary theory. And so to the voyage of the Beagle, a voyage that lasted over 5 years and was the thing that really made Darwin who he was. The reason that the Beagle was sent out in the first place was that the British Navy and the British government wanted to chart the waters around the major land masses of the earth. They wanted to figure out where it was safe to trade, where people were. It was all part and parcel of the wider processes of empire. And we can see its peregrinations as it sailed down the Atlantic, past the Madeiras and the Azores, down to Brazil, on downwards to Tierra del Fuego, doubling back to the Falkland Islands, back up the coast. The beagle traipsed up and down South America and around the Cape Horn and right the way to the Galapagos. And it only reached the Galapagos, just to give you an indication of how much time was spent in South America, in 1835. And then across the Pacific to New Zealand, Australia very briefly. Darwin didn't enjoy his time in Australia. Van Diemen's Land, as it was called then, the Swan River colony, up to Mauritius, across, round the Cape of Good Hope, and back to Britain. It was an immense undertaking. Darwin was signed on board as an amateur naturalist. He was there by the special request of Robert Fitzroy, who was the captain of the Beagle. Captaincy on a ship was a lonely job, a very lonely job indeed. In fact, the previous captain of the Beagle had committed suicide, and there was a history of that kind of thing in Fitzroy's family, and he wanted to guard against the loneliness that would engulf him. It's very hard for the captain to have a social life, even with the officers beneath him. So Darwin's job was basically there to keep Robert Fitzroy company. The traditional view is all that time spent in South America was unimportant compared to the Galapagos that they got to in 1835. Pooh to traditional views. I really don't think that stands up particularly well, because South America proved to be incredibly important. There, some key ideas were reinforced in Darwin's mind. He'd always believed that the human species was a single race, that the different races were part of the one species. And this idea was reinforced as he travelled through the extremely multicultural South America. He also had many confirmations of his belief in the slow, unmoving process of geological formation that allowed for deep time to exist, for the Earth to be millions and millions, even billions of years old, rather than the 5,000 or so years of traditional creationism. And finally, he was able to see some interesting things going on with species. Quite often, he'd find the fossils of extinct species, megafauna, huge versions of the species that he was finding still existing. And he could sort of build an ancestry link between the megafauna and the existing species in South America at that time. He was also able to see that where there were things like environmental barriers, say a river or a mountain range, that you'd find quite similar species on one side and the other side of the barrier, but they were still distinct and different. And of course that was going to feed into his thinking about natural selection. As we've indicated already, the Galapagos have often been viewed as the birthplace of evolution, the place where Darwin underwent a Damascene conversion. The Galapagos, a group of islands separated by extremely deep water at a meeting place between the warm waters of the tropics and the cold waters of the southern oceans, teeming with all sorts of life. And as it turned out, a huge amount of different species on each of the island. Darwin was almost certainly not thinking in any way, shape or form about evolution at this point. And in fact, he really botched up his collections. He was unable to identify at the time that the finches on one island were a different species to the finches on another island. And he was only able to get that after he comes back from the voyage and has to relabel and repiece together the evidence that he's collected. And then there was the case of the tortoises. Again, he didn't initially see that these huge animals that live for hundreds of years, it's quite possible that that particular contemporary Galapagos tortoise was around when Darwin was travelling through the islands. But he didn't notice that different tortoise species lived on different islands. In fact, what they did was they took the tortoises alive, they were going to transport them back, they got a bit hungry, and then they made turtle soup out of them. So it was only in retrospect that Darwin was able to see the importance of the Galapagos once he got back to Britain. And that is where we're going to take up the story in Module 3.